Hey, this is McGarren Flack. We're just going to do a full value drawing, except I'm demonstrating the steps that I would recommend you go through to be able to draw this effectively and quickly, because that does make a difference. So to start out, I have the hardest pencil that I could get, which is a Charcoal HB from Primo. That's this one. And the reason why I want to get the hardest is so that I can create light values. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in a little gesture of what these shapes are going to look like in relationship to each other. So something along those lines. So that's my quick little gesture with a hard pencil. Notice I was holding it at the end of the pencil. I was doing it with a very light hand. And I'm just looking at location. So where is this cone in relationship to this sphere? And now I'm going to break it down even further and figure out how big they are in relationship to each other. A couple of ways to be able to do that. First, you can establish your height for one of your objects. And if I select the sphere and I want this height, then I need to make sure that I also have the width to be the same. So I'm going to take the height here, turn it on its side, and say that it hits there and right about there. So center is going to be right here-ish, maybe a little bit lower. Yeah, a little bit lower. So that means the widest point is going to be here and here. And I can just construct this sphere by drawing a bunch of straight lines. Notice not very beautiful right now, and that's okay. I'm just laying it in, figuring out where my shapes are located. Now I'm going to go to the cone, and the cone sits about right there in relationship to the sphere. So if I come across there, yeah, there's the bottom of it. And then the top of it sits somewhere, around here. The middle, it's a little bit higher than the middle of the cone, so I think my proportion's pretty good. I can measure the difference between it and go the height of my sphere versus the height of the entire cone, since I know that's where the bottom's going to be. So I'll measure my shapes in relationship to the cone. So the cone is just a little bit larger than the sphere. So if I go with the sphere, go there, this needs to drop down just a little bit. Then I'm going to create a plumb line. So this is what you should have learned in the constructive drawing. Plumb line, so it's vertical, and establish the width. I'm just guessing, but I'm going to figure out what the width of the cone is in relationship to the vertical. So it's about 1 1/3. So I take the width here, go 1, and that's almost 2. So that means I need to make it wider. So I'll make this guy wider. And with having that line in the center, I need to shift the center a little bit further over. So if I go that direction, 1, that's about 1/2. So I'm getting closer. And now I go for the cube. The cube, the whole height of the cube is about the same as the sphere, just a little bit smaller. So if I go the sphere, and the cube is set just a little bit higher than the bottom of the sphere, so over here it goes a little bit higher. That would be the height of the entire cube. And the edge of the cube almost touches the edge of that guy. Let's figure out the width of the cube in relationship to its height. So the height of it is the same as the width. So if this is my height, I go here, and there's my width. Okay, but also notice that the cube is not just, I'm not looking at a flat plane. It goes back into space and it divides. So I'm gonna guess it's about there, not quite half of the width. And then there's a slope that comes down. So that's my bottom part. I just have it shifted over a little bit. And then this part goes back just softly. It looks like this needs to go. Now, visually, I'm comparing the width of this versus the width of this part, and also the slope here versus the slope of this part, and the slope of this versus the slope of this part. So I'm comparing these angles to make sure that they're in relationship to each other. I don't, just like in regular drawing class, I don't want to have this line coming up here and this coming out. That makes it look like it's cockeyed and it's popping out the back. So I want to make sure that this line is parallel or close to parallel to this line, and this line is parallel to that line, and this line is parallel to that line, and this line is parallel to that line. So lots of parallel shapes that I want to get into. So now that I have them placed in there proportionately, I'm going to divide the light shape from the shadow shapes. Now we're going to change some gears here. I want you to take a look at the reference that I have. And in the reference, I've broken down each shape to specific values. And looking at the sphere, you can see that there are a lot of different values. And I have drawn an outline on the change of these values. Now they're not specific or exact, but I need to determine which value is where. So just to simplify things a little bit more, if you look at the cube, there's a value 9.5, which is the lightest value, 7.5, which is the top value, and value 5, which is the darkest value on the cube. Those three values are flat and simple. The cast shadow is value 2, that's on the back side of it. The cone and the sphere just have more value ranges because they are turning forms instead of flat planes. And if you look at the shadow of the cone, it is the same value as the cast shadow from the sphere. It's a value 2. The cast shadow from the sphere onto the cone is a 2.5. And when you're looking at these shapes, I want you to take your value scale that you drew out in class and compare them to what you're looking at in your still life so that you can match the correct value with the shapes that you're drawing. If I come into the middle here, there's a shadow that is cast upon this nice cone, and it comes around kind of like that. And then the shadow, there's an airplane. The shadow comes over just about that width, and there's a little break in it. Now I look at the sphere, and the same type of thing. If I go from the center here over just a little bit more, I can construct that general shadow shape. All I'm doing is dividing the lights from the shadows. And this is already done because they are simple planes. Now I'm gonna figure out the shadow shapes underneath the objects. So it goes down like that and shoots back. Same thing with back here. There's a little bit of a light shape that's shooting from the backside there. And I'm going to fill in the rest of this with value once I get to it. And then there's shadow shape that gets cast to the back there. And it's right about there. And then there's another cast shadow from the box that they're sitting in. It's sitting right about there, and it goes about that high. Which is basically almost off the page, so you won't really see that. But most all of this is just completely dark and black. This is very dark. Then I have the core. So now that I have the lights and the shadows broken up, I'm gonna clean up some of my line work a little bit more. And because I drew with a light hand, I can erase them. If I drew with a hard, firm hand onto this page, it will make really dark values and it'll be hard to erase these things because I'm trying to create values now, just not a line, but values. And in order to get good values, I need to have good, clean shapes. And all I'm doing is taking this, getting a new tip onto it so that when I erase it, it will erase instead of smudge. Now that I have the shadow shapes divided from the light shapes, I'm going to make smaller divisions. And again, with a very hard charcoal pencil and a light hand, I'm going to show or describe these shape changes. So when I'm looking here in the shadow, there's not much change on the cone. The cone comes to a good little tip, so I need to clean that up just a little bit more. All right, but in the shadow shapes, they look pretty similar. There is a little bit of a reflected light coming into it, just right off to the edge here on the back. So I'm going to describe that for them. And then there's also, in the light side, there's a highlight, and that highlight sits right about there, and it gets wider as it goes out. And then I have a middle tone that is sitting right about there. So you can see that I'm dividing up these shapes, very light hand, so that I can see where they are in relationship to other shapes. Now the sphere, when I look, I'm going to show the core shadow and describe the core shadow. So here it comes in a little bit. The core shadow kind of drops like that, and then it shoots back under. It is not the same width. It has change in the shape and form. And I'm outlining what I think is the shape. All of this is basically reflected light. So technically, I could come up with this guy and make it a little bit wider. So reflected light that's coming from this cube bouncing off onto it. So I'm gonna have that as a lighter value than this. So that's my two values in the shadows. Now what about my lights? If I go to here, this is my highlight area. This is a matte object, meaning it's not going to reflect very many values. This is a glossy object, and this is also a glossy object. So you're going to get a lot more reflection and contrast in your values with glossy compared to matte. So there's the highlight. And then there is another form that changes like this. So I have the highlight, the light value from the light side, and midtone, and core, and reflected light. And I could even come in if I wanted to and describe the difference between the terminator. So maybe I'll do that. The terminator is pretty consistent around this shape. Kind of like that. And again, the cube, pretty easy. Oh snap, I totally ruined my drawing. Oh, it's ridiculous. All right, so here is the lightest value. This is the second lightest value, and this is the third lightest value. And this is the cast shadow. So I have them divided up. Now that I have all the values basically divided up, the values here on the foreground are gonna be basically the same versus the values that are on the back here and the back there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the contour of my shapes just a little bit more. I want to just describe them a little bit more, and then I'm going to fill them with flat value. So I will demonstrate that. Okay, now that I have the contour of these objects figured out a little bit better and refined and cleaned up, notice I was really working on how to make the sphere be a circle. I don't want to have bulging out objects and flat parts of it and, you know, making it look like a mutated amoeba. That would just not be very good. So I tried to refine that a little bit more. I did refine it a little bit more, but I don't want it to be perfect because I'm going to add value. And when I add value, I can make it look better than what it currently is. Okay, the other thing, when I am measuring this stuff and looking at it, here in real life, it is parallel and vertical. I just noticed in the camera things are looking a little bit sloped. That's because I have the camera set at an angle from my drawing. And so things will look a little bit skewed. But for the most part, this is the best angle I could get without you seeing the back of my head. So now I'm going to break it down into flat values. So I'm going to start off with my lightest value pencil and create the soft light value transitions in the lights. And when it starts to get darker, like this guy is a little bit darker in value, I'm going to put in just a good flat value over all of it to show the difference between the light objects, the mid-tone objects, and then the darker objects. I'm going to use my softest charcoal, which is a 3B. So I'll start working off with that. Go with my light values, speed up the thing so that you can see how I'm doing this, and then go into darker values. Now when I'm creating these lighter values, I'm just going in between the shapes that I drew. I'm also trying not to get too scratchy of a line, but if I do get it a little bit scratchy, that's fine. I can just change my angle and go another direction. The other thing too, you need to consider when you're putting in these values, see how I just lightly changed the angle of that? Just a little bit. I don't want to smudge any of these values. So I'm going to use a pretty light hand and hold my pencil away from the page. So here I have the extender. It's off of the page. I'm not going to apply it. Now, you can take a piece of paper and put your hand on top of the piece of paper that is on top of your drawing, and that will also decrease your smudges. Also, the other thing that I want to be careful about is not getting too dark with my values. I went over the highlight shape because I can just take the eraser, and because I drew it with a light hand, erase that out. And it's a very soft highlight, so it's not a very hard highlight. Now I need to darken up this portion just a little bit more. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing to all the planes that I've divided up with lines and speed it up. Okay, now that I have some values placed in there, all the values in the background are all the values in the background are darker than these white objects. Notice I put value in the white objects, even in the light side of it, because I don't want the pure white of the paper to be showing through until I put in the highlights, because that is as white as you can get is with those highlights. So I want to put value everywhere else so it'll turn the form. Now I'm going to take a darker value and go around and place value over the whole entire drawing. Okay, here's my 3B Primo, really dark charcoal, and I'm going to apply that into the darker areas. Another thing I want to point out, notice how scratchy it is right now. Right now, all I care about is getting values placed down onto the page. So when you're doing your first run through, it doesn't matter how scratchy it looks or anything right now. You'll be able to clean it up by changing your angles and cross-hatching. But as of right now, I just want to put values onto my page so that I can see the value relationships between objects better and determine which values need to go darker and which values need to go lighter. So that's why I am just throwing value down in right now. I know that all of this surrounding these objects are much darker than what is in the white value structure. So the sphere is probably going to be the hardest part you're going to render. And here I get my head in the way, and I know I've got a big head, but it's okay. Render out those forms, make them as soft as you possibly can. The other thing that I want you to notice is my head pops into the camera a little bit and then it leaves. Every time my head disappears from the camera, I'm actually stepping back and looking at it from a distance. And when I say a distance, I'm talking greater than 5 or 6 feet. You want to step away from your drawing so that you can see how soft edges are looking or how hard edges are looking. Okay, notice how many passes I've gone over it now. I've done 2 passes over the darker values that are in the background. It is still looking pretty scratchy, and that's fine because I'm going to continue to work over the layers and flatten them out. So I'll just continue to keep going over these and flattening them out, and then I'm going to go into the shadow shapes of the actual objects, the simple flat ones, and flatten those out. And go from there. Okay, so I've done multiple passes already, and the tip of my pencil is getting really flat. You can see here. But thing that I wanted to show you, look at the difference of value between the background and these foreground objects. So I haven't put in the shadow shapes, but notice that the relationship between the value of the lights versus the value of the darks is getting closer. So these objects are starting to look white in relationship to the background. This background value is still maybe a value 5. And that's where I want you to take your value swatch or your value scale and compare it to your various objects. For example, depending upon which value scale you use, your lightest light might be a value 10. Okay, so that might be a value 10. But the white of the paper is not value 10, it's more like a value 9. So you want to use that as your lightest value, value 9, and then when we go out here to the edge, it might drop down a value to like a value 8. And then this value might go down to a 7. And then we have a 6 on the terminator. And then we have a 4 in the reflected light, and then a 3 in the core, and then a 2 in the cast shadows. It might even be closer than that. But what I want you to do is take your color swatch and compare them. All right, here's a value 9 color swatch. Okay, that is pretty darn close to what we have on the page. It is slightly matte, so depending upon the angle that I have it, I'm holding it parallel with the page now. So that is as light as I would ever be able to get. And when I compare it against the object that I'm looking at, value 9 is for the highlight. Now this is a value 8. And if I compare the value 8, it's gonna be a little bit slightly darker than what I have here at my midtone, and slightly darker than what I have for the lighter side of my midtone. So if I compare it against the object, it will be like an 8.5 on this area. Now I'm making a pretty big jump here. This is a value 5. If I compare it to the current value that I've drawn onto my page, it looks pretty darn close to the value that I have there. If I squint down, it blends in relatively easily, which tends to be close to the same value of the shadow side of the sphere. So I know now that I need to darken all of the values that are surrounding my objects, especially the cast shadows, to get that value structure darker. So I'm going to darken in the values for the cast shadow of that sphere, and also the value that is surrounding the sphere and the cone. Notice I'm cross-hatching, making subtle adjustments. I'm using a really dark or soft charcoal pencil to create these darker values. And I want to do my cross-hatching, slowly build up the darkness of those values. That's basically it. I'm going around the shapes. So this way, it helps you see what are your dark values, what are your mid values, and what are your light values. If you just fully render out one of the forms without taking into consideration the rest of the objects, your values might be too dark or they might be too light. So I like to build up the whole drawing at the same time. And here I'm going into that sphere and dividing the core shadow from the reflected light that is in that shadow side. I still know I'm not dark enough in that background. I need to make it darker, but I want to render out some of these forms that are in the sphere, so it isn't just like white paper that's sticking out there. Then I move on to the shadow shape on the cone. The cone is a middle value cone, so it is darker than the sphere. The sphere and the cube are white objects. That cone is a gray object, but it's glossy, so it reflects the light that is being cast onto the object. I don't know if cast is the right word, but anyways, the light is on the object, and because it's glossy, it's reflecting that light off of the object. The sphere is a matte object, so it is not going to reflect a highlight as strong as a glossy object. So here I just made those values flat on the cone and left the highlight, the quote unquote highlight that is on the middle gray cone. And I start to render out the values that are between the cone and the cube and make those values darker. This is basically it. You just keep cross-hatching and building up your values with a very light hand. I can't stress that enough. Don't know how many times I've seen students jump in and push as hard as they possibly can with their charcoal because they want to get it done fast, and they end up making a huge mess. They can't erase it, and they end up starting over because it just doesn't look good. So be patient, slowly build it up. It's kind of meditative. I mean, if you really think about it, you just sit there, you're drawing a little bit, kind of doodling back and forth. It's soothing, or it can be, unless you have a short attention span, then it's no longer soothing. But anyways, try to focus on building up the values. By this point in the class, you should basically be done with your values. I've divided them between each of the objects. By the first day of class, you should be this far with your drawing. This took me about, I don't know, maybe an hour to do. So if you have 2.5 hours to work on this drawing, you should easily be to this point. If you're not, it's okay. Take it home, spend some time on it, make it a better drawing so that when you come into class, you can refine your values more. So that's it. By day 1, you should be past this point. Now for day 2, this is where you come in and you start to darken down all of your values to the true value relationship within each object and background. It's very important you get the values in the background too. I'm cross-hatching, subtly changing the angle. If I see a little area that is a little bit too light, I'm gonna fill it in. If it's a little too dark, I'm gonna take an eraser and I will erase part of that value so that things are correct. Also notice how soft of a value change I have in each of my objects. I don't have a good hard edge on any one of my objects because I'm slowly building up the values. Once I get a definitive shape and I know exactly what the shape is going to be, then I'll go in with a sharpened pencil tip and refine those edges a lot more. The other thing too to keep in mind is when you are drawing these shapes, and if you draw everything really hard edged, it almost looks fake. And we don't want to go for a fake looking thing. We want to go for more of a natural looking drawing. And the way that we get there is by having softer edges. Not everything has to be hard edged. Not everything has to be soft edged. Heck, if you can get a variety of edges in there, that's even better. Where you have hard edges on the areas where you want people to look and soft edges on the areas that you want to recede in the background. So for example, the sphere. Now that I'm starting to render out the values, I'm going to take the values from that core shadow and blend it into the reflected light and soften that edge more. Now I'm going to come into the terminator and soften the edge quality of the terminator into the halftones. And then I'm going from those halftones into the lighter values. I'm slowly and lightly changing the values. I'm using a pretty hard pencil right now because I don't want to have a big change in value. I just want to have a good subtle change in value. Here, I just refined the edges of the sphere a little bit more, kind of cut it out so that it has a good soft feel to it. The inside of the shape has a soft feel to it. The outside looks like it's cut out. Nice and hard. Okay, now going to the cone, refining those values in the midtones a little bit more. The light values of the midtones in the cone are the same or close to the same as the shadows of the sphere, which I thought was pretty interesting. You'd think, oh, but it's a light shape, so it needs to be as light as the white part of the sphere, but it's not. It's pretty trippy. Values are awesome. The more you can study them and learn about values, the better off you're going to be because you'll be able to see changes really accurately. Here, I'm going in, refining the cube now, erasing out some of those broken shapes that I went too far past the edge and it just looks bad. So I'm erasing that. I mess up too. It's okay. You can mess up your drawing. Just learn how to fix it. And the way you learn how to fix it is by messing it up. It's crazy how that works, but it's true. And I'm just putting in the highlight to show a difference between the top value of that cube, the front value, and then also the shadow side part of the cube. Very light passes. This is like the 4th pass that I've done on that light side of the cube. light values. Now I'm hardening up the edges. I'm committing to the shape because it looks right. The lines look all parallel. Now I'm going in with a harder, or I shouldn't say harder, gosh, I should say softer charcoal. Here it is a softer charcoal. It's again a 3B, not a hard charcoal like an HB, but this is a 3B charcoal pencil. I am pushing a little bit harder and making those values darker as I surround it. I know I could even make it darker if I wanted to, and I'd have to do multiple passes to make it darker in value. Another alternative is to smudge values into the paper. That will also make it darker, but I don't want you to smudge for this assignment. I want you to create value with just your pencil on the paper. See if you can do it. It's pretty challenging, and once you get good at it, it's freaking fun. Did I just say fun with drawing? I did say fun with drawing. It's true. It's really fun. So anyways, going back in, refining up some of these little areas. I want to make the core shadow in the sphere a little bit darker. I had too dark of a value in that reflected light, so I'm erasing it. Also notice that I dabbed with my kneaded eraser. I didn't pull across the drawing with the kneaded eraser, I just dab. Dabbing it with the kneaded eraser will slowly bring up the values and it will not smudge it. If you drag across with your kneaded eraser, it will smudge your values. Here I'm just making a little bit darker value to make it almost look like the surface is reflective at the bottom, and it's reflecting the cube. And refining that sphere. So this would be basically a finished drawing for the assignment. All of the values are realized. They look good in relationship to each other. The background value versus the foreground values, the black objects versus the white objects. So make sure that you go in, clean it up, don't smudge, soft value transitions, light hand, and you'll pull off a stellar drawing. I hope this video was informative, and please enjoy your class time and the time that you are drawing these simple objects with full value. Oh, and have a great day.